Hey everyone, welcome back to Barter Hordes. My name is Robert, and I'm here today to talk about the last two books I read, which were classics. If you've been following my channel recently, I've been on kind of a string of new releases, and I finally got to the bottom of my new release to be read pile and moved on to a couple of classics I've been meaning to reread that I haven't read in a really long time. The first one is Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy, one of my all-time favorite writers. And the second one is by one of my other all-time favorite writers, Jane Austen, but it's her first full novel, the first one she finished anyway, Northanger Abbey. If you notice in the pictures, I read both of them in the Penguin English Library editions, which I've just started getting a few of and I really like. It takes forever to get them from Book Depository coming from England. They're not available directly from many of the big booksellers here in the United States. I've heard disconcerting rumors that the series has been discontinued and they're not all still available. I was trying to get a copy of Jude the Obscure the other day and it's no longer available. But then I've heard from another source that perhaps they're reissuing some of them, so I don't know what the real status is, but I really like those editions. First of all, they look really nice. They have very unique covers. The whole series looks similar, but each book has its own thematic cover. They're all designed by the same artist. But they fit really well in my hand. I like the paper. They're very simple editions where it's primarily just the text, and then at the end of the text there's a single essay that kind of takes that book into account in the history of that writer. And so I really enjoy that format. I've got a lot of the Penguin Classics, the American editions, and I've just never really felt they were as nice or as comfortable, even though they're readily available. Sorry about that, there's boats playing horn games on the river. Even though those Penguin Classics editions are very inexpensive and they're readily available, I've just never really liked them as much as I do these Penguin English Library editions. So I'm going to try to pick up a few more of those before they start disappearing. Anyway, on to Thomas Hardy, Far from the Madding Crowd. This one was written in 1874. It's set in the 1840s, so it's kind of in the golden era for English agriculture, before some big changes came about towards the end of the 19th century. And Hardy is writing this one, it's almost the first of a series, although it's not really a series, but it's the first one of what he calls his Wessex novels. Wessex is a term that he resurrected from antiquity to describe the region in southwestern England. It's more than just a single county. It encompasses several counties. But it's part real, part imagined. And so he uses Wessex to write his stories about the southern counties, about farming life, about the natural world and man's place in that world. And you see that starting to be developed here in this first of the Wessex books, Far from the Madding Crowd. This book is a little bit less dismal. It's not as dark as his more mature books from Wessex. When you get into The Mayor of Casterbridge and Tess of the D'Urbervilles, one of my absolute favorite novels of all time, and Jude the Obscure, which I'm going to do a buddy read with Claire of Claire Reads Books later this month on Jude the Obscure. When you get into those later books, his vision of man's place in society is much less optimistic. It's governed more by fate, it seems like, than by free will or chance. You can't really escape what the world is going to do to you in his later books. In Far from the Madding Crowd, though, it still ends up as a classical comedy in the sense that there is a reunion at the end, and it ends somewhat happily rather than the dismal tragedies of his later books. But you see a lot of those themes that he's developing about the natural world and how the natural world is by far more valuable to us as people than what's going on in the cities and the changes that are coming about. It's one of the reasons why he chose Far from the Madding Crowd as his title, is that we are removed from the madding crowd. And it's a line from a poem by Thomas Gray, an elegy written in a country churchyard. And so it's that ideal that the farm life, the natural cycle of farm life is much better for us as people than what's going on in the cities. And so he doesn't write about London. He writes about these rural areas in England. It's a wonderful introduction, I think, to Thomas Hardy's novels. The first time you read Hardy, you're going to have to go more slowly than you're probably used to when you read contemporary books. His language can be dense. He can write a sentence that will go on for lines and lines and lines. But his word choices are so rich, and his language and his sentence structures are so rich that it pays you back to read it a little more slowly. And so I had, even with this one, and I'm a longtime Hardy fan, I felt myself having to slow myself down to the point where ultimately I ended up doing this book as a joint audiobook and text book. I listened to the audiobook while I read the text. And over the last year, I've grown to really enjoy doing that when I have the time to do that, because it does slow me down and I do catch more of the richness of the language and the syntax that way. And with somebody like Hardy, I think that's really enjoyable. I've just recently discovered that our public library has subscriptions both to Overdrive and to Hoopla, and a lot of the classics are available on Hoopla, and there's no waiting list. And so my local library allows us to take out up to 8 a month, which is pretty generous. I know they're not cheap. And so I was able to grab both this one and the Jane Austen through Hoopla and do a joint audio and text read, which I found really beneficial, although a little bit slower. You can't read quickly if you're doing this. But I think with a 19th century novel like this, where it is using different cadences from our speech today, that it makes sense to slow down a little bit to get the richness of the language. So if you're interested at all in Thomas Hardy, I would say start with Far from the Madding Crowd before you go on to his more famous works, The Mayor of Casterbridge, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and Jude the Obscure, all of which I recommend wholeheartedly, but I think you might get into Hardy a little bit easier by starting with Far from the Madding Crowd. The other book I read, another 19th century classic novelist by Jane Austen, Northanger Abbey, is the first book that she finished and sold. She actually sold the book in 1803, but because of a contract problem or some kind of a flap with the publisher, it actually didn't come out until 15 years later, the year after she dies. She dies in 1817, and it's not even published until 1818. And when it comes out, it's bound with her very last novel, Persuasion. And so that particular binding is a really unusual juxtaposition of her first and last published novels. Before Northanger Abbey, she wrote a lot of partial attempts. There's a lot of her juvenilia still existent, but most people consider Jane Austen to have written 6 novels, and Northanger Abbey is the first of those, but it's also very different in character to the other 5 in some ways, that it almost seems like it's a bridge from her apprenticeship into her full-fledged works as an important novelist. And a lot of people who love Jane Austen love Northanger Abbey, but they also admit that it's not the best of the 6 books by far. It is, as all of Jane Austen's books are, ultimately about a marriage. Sometimes her books include as many as 3 marriages, but this one's just about a single relationship, more or less. The story is about a young woman who goes off with some friends to Bath, a resort city, and she's there for weeks and weeks and weeks, and her family meets another family there, and she becomes fast friends with a young lady named Isabella. And it's very obvious to us as readers early on that she is completely innocent. She's naive of the way the world works. She doesn't see beyond the surface of the people who speak to her. And she's misled by that innocence in ways that some of Jane Austen's later heroines are not. She's extremely innocent. And so the first half of the book is about her meeting different people in Bath, becoming fast friends with Isabella. Isabella's brother becomes enamored with her, and almost to the point where he's hinting that he might propose to her, and she's really not interested in him at all. He also happens to be her brother's best friend, so there's some entanglement there. But what she finally does is she meets another family, the Tilneys, and she falls for Henry Tilney. But it's an uneven match, and one of the things people complain about with Northanger Abbey is that they don't seem to be well matched. She's very innocent, she's younger than he is, which is not that unusual, but he's pretty world wise, and he's ironic sometimes, and she does not understand his irony, and you kind of wonder where they're going to go in the future if she doesn't rise her level to his intellectually. Will they really be compatible? Think about all the marriages and all the other Jane Austen novels, all of them seem fairly well matched. They're getting what they expect, they're getting what they wanted, and you see a future for them in some ways. May not always be a happy future, but it's kind of what you expect from those two particular characters. In Northanger Abbey, that's not really ever clear why these two characters get together. It's a little bit odd of a pairing, but more of a problem than the marriage and the romance in this book for me was the writing style. It's very clearly early Jane Austen. She goes on long digressions through the narrator's voice. She gets away from the story quite readily, and she spends more of the novel telling us what we should be thinking rather than showing us, whereas in her later works there's a much more balanced view between the narrator's commentary on the characters and the characters' interactions themselves. But in this book, the narrator will go off for several pages and just change topics or tell you what to think. There's a lot of telling instead of showing. And one of the most famous examples is Jane Austen's defense of the novel as a form. In chapter 5, she writes an entire essay that's defending novels and attacking other novelists for not being protective of each other. It's a brilliant passage, but it has nothing really to do with the Northanger Abbey story. But it all kind of goes off track in the second half, where the main character goes and visits the Tilneys at Northanger Abbey. She's invited to spend time there, and of course she's delighted to go because she's already finding herself in love with Henry, and she also likes Miss Tilney, Henry's sister, quite well. But she's a fan of novels like The Mysteries of Udolpho by Mrs. Radcliffe. And these mysteries and gothic romances have kind of turned her head a little bit, where she goes to Northanger Abbey almost assuming that she's going to find some mystery there because it's an old abbey rather than just a private home. And so she spends much of the second half of the book talking herself into these mysteries about the family that she's visiting, and to the point where she's making some wild assumptions that are pretty bold. She's sooner rather than later, she is disabused of these false theories, and she realizes how foolish she's been. And then there's a separation, and then they come back together as you expect, and they get married at the end, as all Jane Austen books end with marriages. If that's a spoiler to you, you really need to read some Jane Austen. It's really hard to talk about 19th century novels without spoilers. There's just not much point in a book that's that old. But I enjoyed Northanger Abbey, but reading the essay at the end of the book this morning, one of the things that struck me, and I was thinking it as I was reading, is that this would be a really hard story to film. And then the author, or the author of the article at the end of the edition I was reading this morning, said the same thing, that there is a film of this, but it's not very successful. It's very difficult to do. It's not like her other novels, which are all very easily adaptable to film. And I'm a huge fan of Pride and Prejudice, of course. It's one of the books that I've taught for years and years and years, so I know that novel very well, but don't know the other 5 novels nearly as well. So over the next year or so, I hope to reread all of the other 4. I recently taught Pride and Prejudice the last semester I was teaching, and now I've reread Northanger Abbey, so I'm ready to go on to the other 4. But if you haven't read Jane Austen, she is just so smart. Her satire is so skewering. She just takes down fools in a short phrase or a sentence, and it's just glorious. It's wonderful. Some people are tremendously bored by Jane Austen's books because nothing dramatic ever seems to happen. But the drama is in the social interaction and the way she is lampooning various members of society, and by doing that, showing you what human values she thinks are important and valuable, and those are rewarded in her books usually. So it's a really, I think it's a wonderful collection of novels. Pride and Prejudice is probably still my favorite of all her novels, but I'm looking forward to rereading the others I haven't read as often. So if you haven't read either of these two writers, or you're looking to go back to them, both of these are kind of introductions to their work. Far from the Madding Crowd is an introduction to his later Wessex, more tragic works, and Northanger Abbey is kind of the bridge into Jane Austen's complete novels, away from her juvenilia and her unfinished attempts at novels that only the most die-hard Jane Austen fans really read today. So there you have it, two classics that you can go back and look towards. I have a kind of a mixed up month coming ahead. I'm going to be doing a little bit of traveling in April. I am moving this summer to a new townhouse in Durham, North Carolina, where I lived before I moved down here to Florida. And so I have to go meet next week with the builder and the designer and talk about where different things go and all those wonderful details. So I'm going to drive up there for a couple days and then come back. So I'll be on the road a little bit, but I'm also doing 2 buddy reads, which I've not done before. So this is going to be fun for me. I'm doing a buddy read of The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie by Muriel Spark. I'm doing that with Leah of Hide and Seek. And then I'm doing a buddy read of the Thomas Hardy novel, Jude the Obscure, with Claire from Claire Reads Books later in April. So I'm really looking forward to those. I also have 2 more videos that I want to try to film this week. So you may see me a little bit more than usual, but it's time, now that it's April, to do the recommendations for April from independent booksellers from around America, like I did for March. Enough people seem to like that I think I'll continue with that. I'm still playing with the idea of splitting it up into 4 videos that I do 1 a week, each week during April, rather than what I did this time, which was 2 videos back to back, both of which were nearly 20 minutes, so they're kind of long. My real hesitation to do the longer videos is my upload speed here at home is so dismally slow that it takes hours to upload every video, and it's extremely frustrating. Everything else about the process of making a video I enjoy, but sitting there and watching that upload go 80% of the way there and then fail and having to start over again and sit for another 2 hours drives me crazy, because I can't do anything else online while it's uploading, or I lose all speed altogether. But I need to do those April recommendations. It's a good list of books I'm looking forward to sharing with you, and some of which I've already ordered. I'm ready to go. And I also have a tag video. Sean the Book Maniac tagged me in a video challenge last week that I've been thinking about answers to, that I hope to do later this week as well. So I have a couple things planned this week as I get into reading. Probably do a little bit of nonfiction before I do the buddy reads. So I may read 1 or 2 nonfiction books this next week. So that's it for me. Please leave a comment if you've read either of the books I talked about today, or would like a little bit more information about them. I'd be glad to talk to you about Thomas Hardy and Jane Austen. And I will see you again very soon. Bye.